The morning sun of Nexus Prime cast long shadows across the crystal towers of the Stellar Military Academy. Students from dozens of worlds walked through the corridors, their different forms creating a strange parade of colors, shapes, and sizes. Some had wings, others had multiple arms, and a few glowed with their own inner light. Hannah walked quietly among them, her simple human form looking plain next to the exotic aliens around her. She carried her books in an old-fashioned bag, while other students used floating devices or stored information directly in their enhanced minds. Her black hair was tied back in a simple style, and her dark eyes took in everything around her with careful attention. The academy was famous across the galaxy. Only the best military minds came here to study warfare, strategy, and the art of combat. Each species sent their brightest students to learn from others and share their own knowledge. For 300 years, the academy had been a place where different worlds came together to study war and peace. Hannah entered Professor Veltar's classroom just as the morning chime sounded. The room was large and round, with seats arranged in circles so everyone could see each other. She took her usual spot in the back row, setting down her simple notebook and pen while other students activated holographic displays and neural interfaces. Professor Veltar entered the room with his usual dramatic flair. The Altarian was tall and thin, with 6 arms that moved independently as he spoke. His skin was a deep blue color that shifted to purple when he was excited about a topic. 2 of his arms held data tablets while the other 4 gestured as he talked. "Good morning, future military leaders," Veltar said, his voice carrying easily through the room. "Today we continue our study of comparative military analysis. We will examine how different species approach warfare and what makes each military tradition unique." The students straightened in their seats. This was always an interesting topic because everyone got to talk about their own people's way of fighting. It was a chance to show off and prove why their species was special. Crystal was the first to speak. The Vortex student stood up, his crystalline body catching the light and throwing rainbow patterns on the walls. "The Vorthic Empire has perfected energy manipulation warfare," he said with obvious pride. "Our soldiers can channel the power of stars themselves. We create weapons from pure light and shields from crystallized space." Other students nodded with respect. The Vorthak were known across the galaxy for their energy weapons. Their battles looked like light shows, with beams of power cutting through space and beautiful but deadly energy fields protecting their troops. Next came Vespera, a student from the Luminari species. She looked like a giant moth with wings that glowed soft silver. When she spoke, her voice was like music. "The Luminari use harmony in battle," she explained. "Our warriors move as one mind, one purpose. We create songs of war that guide our movements and confuse our enemies. No other species can match our unity." The insectoid Zephyrians buzzed their approval through their translator devices. Their representative, a creature that looked like a walking stick with too many legs, clicked rapidly. "Hive tactics superior," the translation said in choppy words. "One mind control, 1,000 bodies. Perfect coordination. No confusion, no fear, only victory." A student from the reptilian Drex species hissed softly before speaking. "The Drex are born for war," he said, his forked tongue flicking out as he talked. "Our scales are natural armor. Our claws are natural weapons. We do not need your technology tricks. We are weapons ourselves." Professor Veltar nodded at each presentation, making notes with 2 of his hands while the other 4 continued their constant movement. "Excellent examples," he said. "Each species has developed military traditions that match their natural abilities and cultural values." The discussion continued for another hour. The silicon-based Korthans talked about their ability to survive in any environment. The aquatic Gelthans explained their 3-dimensional battle tactics. The energy beings called Nexari described warfare that existed on levels other species could barely understand. Through it all, Hannah sat quietly and took notes with her simple pen and paper. She watched the other students gesture and boast about their people's military might. She listened to descriptions of weapons that could destroy planets and defenses that could stop time itself. She said nothing, Some students glanced at her occasionally, as if remembering that humans were part of the galaxy now, but no one asked her to speak. Humans were new to the galactic community. They had only been in space for a short time compared to other species. Most of the alien students thought of humans as primitive creatures who had barely learned to leave their homeworld. Humans use kinetic weapons, one student whispered to another, loud enough for others to hear. They throw metal pieces at each other, very simple. I heard they still fight on the ground, another added. They walk around on planets instead of fighting in space like civilized beings. Do they even have energy shields? A third student asked, how do they survive without proper protection? Hannah heard the whispers but did not react. She continued taking notes about Altarian battle meditation and Korth crystalline warfare tactics. Her face showed no expression as the other students talked about her species like they were discussing interesting but harmless animals. Professor Veltar either did not hear the whispers or chose to ignore them. He was focused on his lecture about how different environmental pressures created different military solutions. The frozen worlds of the Korth sector produced warriors who could fight in absolute zero temperatures, he explained. The high-gravity planets of the Drex home system created soldiers with incredible physical strength. As the class time came to an end, Veltar assigned homework for the next week. I want each of you to research a military conflict from a species different from your own, he said. Choose something that shows how environmental and cultural factors shaped military development. We will present our findings next class. Students began gathering their things and talking among themselves about their research topics. Some planned to study famous battles from history. Others wanted to examine weapon development or tactical evolution. Hannah packed her simple notebook and pen into her bag. She stood up slowly, listening to the excited chatter around her. The alien students were already forming groups to share research and help each other. No one approached her as she walked toward the door. Hannah heard Crystal talking loudly to a group of other students. I think I will research human military history, he said with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. It should not take long. They have been in space for what, 100 years? How much could they have learned about warfare in such a short time? Other students laughed with him. Make sure to include their stick and stone period, Vespera added, her musical voice carrying a note of mockery. I heard they used to fight with sharp metal pieces attached to long handles. Spears, another student said. Very advanced technology. Hannah paused at the door but did not turn around. Her hand tightened slightly on her bag strap, but her face remained calm. She stepped into the hallway and walked away as the laughter continued behind her. The corridors of the academy were busy with students moving between classes. Hannah walked slowly, thinking about what she had heard. She knew what the other students thought about humans. She knew they saw her people as newcomers, who had nothing important to contribute to galactic military knowledge. She also knew they were wrong. The next week arrived with the usual morning rush at the Stellar Military Academy. Students hurried through the corridors carrying their research projects and chattering about what they had discovered. The excitement was obvious as they prepared to share their findings about different military traditions across the galaxy. Hannah entered Professor Veltar's classroom and took her usual seat in the back row. She carried the same simple notebook and pen, but today there was something different about her. She sat straighter, and her dark eyes seemed more focused as she watched the other students file in. Professor Veltar swept into the room with his characteristic energy. His 6 arms moved in complex patterns as he organized his materials and prepared for the presentations. Today we hear your research findings, he announced. Each presentation will help us understand how different species approach the art of warfare. Crystal was eager to go first. The crystalline Vorthax student stood up with obvious confidence, his body catching the morning light and casting rainbow patterns on the walls. He activated a holographic display that showed star maps and battle formations. I researched the military conflicts of the Terran species, he began, and several students turned to look at Hannah. As expected, their warfare is quite primitive, compared to civilized galactic standards. The hologram showed images of human soldiers carrying what looked like simple metal weapons. The alien students leaned forward with interest, many of them seeing human military equipment for the first time. Humans use what they call kinetic weapons, Krikstal continued with barely hidden amusement. These are devices that throw small pieces of metal at high speed. They have no energy manipulation, no plasma fields, no quantum disruption. Just metal pieces flying through space. Several students made sounds of amazement. The concept seemed almost impossible to believe. How could any species fight wars with such simple tools? They also engage in something called ground combat, Krikstal went on. Instead of fighting properly in space, they actually land on planets and walk around shooting at each other. They hide behind rocks and trees like primitive hunters. Vespera's wings fluttered with what might have been laughter. Do they not have proper battle coordination? She asked in her musical voice. How do they manage military operations without hive minds or harmonic linking? They use something called radio communication, Krikstal replied. Individual soldiers talk to each other through electronic devices. Very slow and inefficient. Each human makes their own decisions in battle instead of following a unified mind. The Zephyrian student buzzed disapprovingly. Individual thinking in combat illogical, the translator device said. Causes confusion, causes mistakes, causes death. Krikstal nodded agreement. Exactly. Human military doctrine seems designed for maximum inefficiency. They even have something called individual initiative, where soldiers are encouraged to act independently when communications fail. Professor Veltar listened to the presentation with growing interest. His blue skin had shifted to a lighter shade, which usually meant he was thinking deeply about something. Fascinating, he said. Continue with your analysis. The most ridiculous part, Krikstal said, warming to his topic, is their attitude toward casualties. Most civilized species understand that military operations should minimize losses through superior technology and tactics. Humans seem to accept that soldiers will die in large numbers. They even have terms like acceptable losses and necessary sacrifices. The alien students exchanged shocked looks. The idea of accepting military deaths as normal was disturbing to species that had developed warfare into precise, technological contests where casualties were rare. They also lack proper defensive systems, Krikstal continued. No energy shields, no quantum barriers, no temporal displacement fields. Human soldiers are protected only by pieces of metal and ceramic plates they wear on their bodies. Very primitive. Armor that can be penetrated by their own simple weapons. A student from the Nexari Energy Being Collective spoke up. How do they survive battles without proper protection? Their bodies are so fragile compared to most species. They do not survive very well, Krikstal replied with what might have been sympathy. Human military casualties are extremely high. By galactic standards, they seem to accept this as normal. Professor Veltar made notes with two of his hands while the other four gestured thoughtfully. Interesting evolutionary adaptation, he mused. Perhaps their species developed warfare under different pressures than the rest of us. The presentation continued for several more minutes. Krikstal showed images of human weapons that looked crude compared to the elegant energy devices used by other species. He described human tactics that seemed chaotic and wasteful compared to the precise, coordinated maneuvers of civilized military forces. Other students began sharing their own findings about human warfare. Someone had discovered that humans fought wars on their home planet for thousands of years before reaching space. Another student found records showing that humans had conflicts involving millions of soldiers at once. Millions? Vespera asked, her glowing wings dimming with shock. How many soldiers do humans have? According to galactic records, another student replied, Earth has a population of over 7 billion humans. Their military forces number in the millions across all branches. The number was staggering. Most species had military forces in the thousands at most. The idea of millions of soldiers was almost impossible to comprehend. The discussion grew more animated as students shared increasingly strange discoveries about human military culture. They had found references to humans fighting in conditions that would kill most other species. They discovered weapons designed specifically to cause maximum damage to living tissue. They learned about human training methods that seemed designed to break down individuals and rebuild them as killers. The humans call their soldiers warriors, one student reported. But they do not fight for honor or glory like civilized species. They fight for concepts like duty and country and survival. Professor Veltar's skin had shifted to a deeper blue, indicating deep thought or concern. These are very different military concepts than we typically study, he admitted. Human warfare appears to be based on different philosophical foundations than galactic norms. The classroom had grown quiet as students processed what they were learning. The initial amusement at human primitive weapons had faded as they began to understand the scale and intensity of human military culture. That was when Hannah raised her hand. The movement was small and quiet, but Professor Veltar noticed immediately. All eyes turned to the human student who had remained silent through weeks of classes. Some students looked curious. Others seemed slightly nervous about hearing from an actual human about her species' military traditions. "Yes, Hannah?" Professor Veltar said encouragingly. "Do you have something to add to our discussion?" Hannah stood up slowly. Her simple human appearance looked even more plain next to the exotic alien students around her. She was shorter than most of them, with no special features or impressive technology. Just a young woman with dark hair and dark eyes. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. It carried easily through the suddenly silent classroom. "What's the kill count for a single Earth Marine?" The question hung in the air like a physical thing. Students looked at each other with confusion. Professor Veltar's 6 arms stopped their constant movement for the first time anyone could remember. "I'm sorry," the professor said after a moment. "Could you repeat the question?" Hannah's expression had not changed. She looked directly at Professor Veltar as she spoke again. "What's the kill count for a single Earth Marine?" The silence that followed was complete. No student moved. No translator device made a sound. Even the background hum of the academy's system seemed to fade away. Professor Veltar stared at the human student with all 6 of his eyes. His skin had shifted to a pale, almost white shade that none of the students had ever seen before. I do not know," he admitted finally. "That is a very specific question." Hannah nodded once and sat back down. She opened her notebook and picked up her pen as if nothing had happened. But something had changed in the classroom. The air felt different, heavier. Crystal was the first to speak, his crystalline voice uncertain for the first time. "What do you mean by kill count? That is a strange term." But Hannah had returned to taking notes and did not answer. She wrote in her simple notebook as if the question had never been asked. Professor Veltar looked around at his students, then back at Hannah. Something in her quiet manner had shaken him in a way he did not understand. "Class dismissed," he said suddenly. "We will continue this discussion next week." As students filed out of the classroom, many of them whispered to each other about the strange question the human had asked. But none of them knew what it meant. None of them yet understood what they were about to discover. Professor Veltar sat alone in his office after the last student had left. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of data processors and the gentle glow of information displays floating around his desk. His 6 arms moved restlessly as he thought about the strange question the human student had asked. "What's the kill count for a single Earth Marine?" The words echoed in his mind. In all his years of teaching military analysis, no student had ever asked such a direct and specific question about individual combat effectiveness. Most species discussed military units, technology, or strategic concepts, but this human had asked about one soldier. One Marine. Veltar activated his research interface with 2 hands while the other 4 organized his notes from the day's class. The holographic displays around him lit up with data streams from the Galactic Military Database. He had access to information about every known species and their military capabilities. Surely finding information about human Marines would be Simple. He started with basic searches. Human military structure, Earth Defense Forces, Terran colonial security. The results showed organizational charts, equipment lists, and training programs. Everything looked normal for a newly spacefaring species. Simple weapons, basic tactics, standard military hierarchy, but none of it answered Hannah's question. Veltar tried more specific searches. Human Marine Corps, Earth Marine Training, Terran Marine Operations. The database provided more detailed information about human military units called Marines. They seemed to be specialized soldiers used for difficult missions, still nothing. About individual effectiveness, the professor leaned back in his chair, his blue skin shifting to a purple shade that indicated deep concentration. He had been teaching military analysis for decades. He had studied the warfare methods of dozens of species. He understood tactical doctrine, strategic planning, and military organization. But he had never encountered a question quite like this. What made it more disturbing was the way the human student had asked it. Not with curiosity or academic interest, but with a quiet certainty that suggested she already knew the answer. As if she was testing whether the galactic academic community understood something important about her species. Veltar tried a different approach. Instead of searching for specific numbers, he looked for battle reports involving human Marines. The database showed several recent conflicts where human military units had been involved. Colonial disputes, piracy suppression, peacekeeping operations. All routine missions for a species expanding into space. But as he read the reports more carefully, strange details began to emerge. In the Kepler colony incident, a human Marine unit of 12 soldiers had ended a rebellion that involved over 300 armed colonists. The report listed the outcome as minimal casualties but did not specify how few humans had been lost. During the Proxima Station piracy crisis, a single platoon of human Marines had boarded and captured 5 enemy vessels simultaneously. The pirates had numbered in the hundreds. The human force had been 30 soldiers. The Arcturus border dispute showed similar patterns. Human military units consistently achieved objectives while operating with what seemed like impossibly small numbers compared to their opposition. Veltar began pulling up more detailed files. His 6 arms worked frantically as he cross-referenced battle reports, casualty lists, and operational summaries. What he found made his skin shift to a pale, almost white color. Human military units did not just complete their missions. They completed them with casualty ratios that made no sense according to galactic military doctrine. In conflict after conflict, humans fought against superior numbers, and won with minimal losses to themselves, but the reports were frustratingly vague about specific details. They mentioned effective suppression of hostile forces and successful neutralization of threats without giving exact numbers. It was as if the humans were deliberately avoiding precise counts of enemy casualties. The professor tried accessing classified military databases. His academic credentials gave him limited access to restricted information for research purposes. What he found in the classified files made him stop breathing for several seconds. Operation Clearing. Storm, a human marine company of 180 soldiers, had pacified an entire planet during a colonial uprising. The hostile forces had numbered over 15,000 armed rebels. The operation had lasted 3 weeks. Human casualties, 12 wounded, 0 killed. The Titan mining conflict. 48 human Marines had ended a worker rebellion involving 6,000 armed miners in fortified positions. The humans had used what they called minimum necessary force. The result: complete surrender of rebel forces after 18 hours of combat. Veltar stared at the numbers on his screen. These ratios were impossible. No species in the galaxy achieved military results like this. Even the most advanced civilizations with superior technology rarely manage such overwhelming tactical success. He began searching for information about human marine training. What he discovered made his hands tremble as he scrolled through the files. Human Marines were trained for something called amphibious assault operations. They specialized in attacking heavily defended positions from multiple directions simultaneously. They learned to fight in environments that would kill most other species, underwater in toxic atmospheres, in extreme temperatures and zero gravity, but the most disturbing discovery was the psychological profile of human Marines. Unlike other species that trained soldiers for specific tactical roles, humans created what they called adaptive warriors. These Marines were taught to think independently, to improvise weapons from available materials, to continue fighting even when isolated from command and support. The training records showed methods that seemed designed to break down individual identity and rebuild it around concepts like unit cohesion and mission accomplishment. Human Marines were conditioned to view their own survival as secondary to completing their objectives. Veltar found references to something called close quarters combat training. The description made him feel sick. Human Marines were taught dozens of ways to kill other beings with their bare hands. They practiced techniques for fighting in confined spaces. In darkness, while wounded, while outnumbered, they were trained to use anything as a weapon. Eating utensils, writing implements, pieces of broken equipment. The philosophy seemed to be that a human Marine should be able to kill an enemy even if completely disarmed. As the hours passed, Veltar discovered more and more disturbing information. Human Marines trained with weapons that were designed specifically to kill living beings as efficiently as possible. They studied tactics that assumed they would be outnumbered and outgunned in every engagement. They prepared for combat scenarios that other species would consider suicide missions, but most disturbing of all was the human concept of acceptable losses. The files showed that human military planners expected a certain percentage of their soldiers to die in every operation. They calculated these expected deaths into their mission planning. They considered it normal. Other species used technology and superior tactics to minimize casualties. Humans seemed to accept that their soldiers would die and planned accordingly. This was not because they did not value their people's lives, but because they understood that some objectives required sacrifice. Veltar tried to find records of human Marines in individual combat situations. The results were scattered and often incomplete, but a pattern emerged. Single human Marines regularly engaged and defeated multiple enemies. Small human units consistently outperformed much larger enemy forces. One report mentioned a human Marine named Jin Hoon who had single-handedly defended a landing zone against 47 attackers. Another described a Marine called Young Ho who had eliminated an entire enemy command structure during a night raid. A third file referenced a female Marine, Suyang, who had disabled a heavily fortified position by infiltrating it alone and neutralizing the defenders from inside. These were not exceptional cases. They were routine examples of human Marine operations. As midnight approached, Professor Veltar finally found what he was looking for. Buried deep in a classified after-action report was a statistical analysis of human Marine effectiveness. The numbers were listed in a simple chart that looked innocent until he understood what it meant. Average confirmed. Eliminations per Marine per deployment, 847 hostile entities. Average probable eliminations per Marine per deployment, 1,204 hostile entities. Average enemy force. Neutralization rate, 94.7%. Average Marine survival rate, 97.3%. Veltar stared at the numbers for a long time. Each human Marine, on average, killed over 800 enemies during a single deployment. The survival rate meant that almost every Marine lived through missions that involved eliminating hundreds of hostile forces. He checked the data again to make sure he understood correctly. These were not totals for entire units. These were individual statistics. Each Marine, personally, eliminated hundreds of enemies while maintaining an extremely high personal survival rate. Suddenly, Hana's question made perfect sense. She had not been asking for academic information. She had been testing whether the galactic community understood what they were dealing with when they looked at a human in a classroom. Every human Marine was a killing machine that could eliminate hundreds of. The week that followed Professor Veltar's research assignment was unlike any other in the history of the Stellar Military Academy. Students who had approached their homework with casual interest found themselves staying awake late into the night. Staring at data that challenged everything they thought they knew about warfare, Crystal was among the first to make disturbing discoveries. The crystalline Vorthak student had intended to do a quick search about human peacekeeping missions, expecting to find simple reports about crowd control and basic law enforcement. Instead, he found himself reading about something called Operation Iron Resolve. The mission summary seemed routine at first. Human peacekeepers had been sent to restore order on a colonial world where local factions were fighting over mining rights. The conflict involved approximately 12,000 armed combatants spread across multiple settlements. The human force consisted of one Marine expeditionary unit. Crystal had to look up what that meant, and knew turned out to be roughly 2,000 Marines plus support personnel. Simple mathematics suggested the humans were outnumbered 6-1, which seemed like poor planning for a peacekeeping mission, but the operation results made no sense. The conflict had been resolved in 8 days. All 12,000 combatants had surrendered or been neutralized. Human casualties were listed as 43 wounded, 0 killed. No explanation was given for how such results had been achieved. Crystal dug deeper into the classified annexes of the report. What he found there made his crystalline structure dim with shock. The humans had not negotiated a peaceful solution. They had systematically hunted down every armed group on the planet, eliminated those who resisted, and captured the rest. They had done this while moving through hostile terrain, coordinating multiple simultaneous operations, and maintaining perfect communication discipline. The tactical analysis showed that human Marines had engaged enemy forces in over 300 separate firefights during the 8-day operation. In every single engagement, the humans had achieved victory despite being outnumbered. The average engagement ratio was 1 Marine for every 4 enemies, and the Marines had won every time. In his dormitory room, Crystal stared at the numbers and tried to understand how they were possible. His own species, the Vorthak, were considered elite warriors. Their energy manipulation abilities gave them significant advantages in combat. But even the best Vorthak units rarely achieved better than 2-1 kill ratios against comparable enemies. These humans were achieving 6-1 ratios against entrenched defenders while operating on an unfamiliar planet with limited support. And they were doing it consistently, repeatedly, as if it was normal. Meanwhile, Vespera was making her own unsettling discoveries. The moth-like Luminari student had been researching human urban warfare tactics, expecting to find crude methods of fighting in cities. Instead, she found operational reports that read like horror stories. The Ganymede Station incident involved human Marines clearing a space station that had been taken over by pirates. The station's complex layout included over 2,000 separate compartments connected by maintenance tunnels, ventilation shafts, and zero-gravity access ways. The pirates numbered approximately 800, and knew the station's layout perfectly. The human force consisted of just 60 Marines who had never been on the station before. They had no detailed maps and no intelligence about enemy positions. The operation took 14 hours from insertion to completion. All pirates were eliminated or captured. The Marines suffered 12 minor injuries and 0 deaths, but the operational details were what disturbed Vespera the most. The humans had split into small teams and moved through the station like predators. They used the complex environment to their advantage, appearing from unexpected directions and disappearing before the pirates could respond effectively. They had turned the station's own systems against the defenders, using life support controls and gravity generators as weapons. Most shocking of all, the Marines had done this without a unified command consciousness. Each team had operated independently, making their own tactical decisions while somehow coordinating perfectly with the other teams. For a species like the Luminari that relied on harmonic mental linking for military coordination, the idea of such precise teamwork without shared consciousness was almost impossible to comprehend. The Zephyrian student was discovering similar patterns in human squad-level tactics. Unlike the hive-mind coordination that defined Zephyrian warfare, human squads operated as collections of independent thinkers who somehow achieved perfect coordination through training and practice. Individual. Human Marines were expected to take command if their leaders were killed. They were trained to operate alone if separated from their units. They could function as snipers, assault troops, demolition experts, or medics depending on what the situation required. Each Marine was essentially a complete military unit compressed into a single being. As the week progressed, students began sharing their findings in hushed conversations throughout the academy. What started as academic curiosity had become something approaching fear as the true scope of human military capability became clear. Jing Ho, one of the human students at the academy, watched his alien classmates with growing concern. He could see the shock and disbelief in their faces as they discovered what his species was capable of. He tried to provide context when approached, but his explanations only made things worse. "You have to understand," he told a group of students in the academy cafeteria, "humans didn't choose to be good at warfare. We had to become good at it to survive." But this explanation only raised more questions. Why had humans needed to become so efficient at killing? What kind of world produced beings that could eliminate hundreds of enemies and consider it routine? Minju, another human student studying xenobiology, attempted to explain human evolutionary development. "Earth is what galactic scientists classify as a death world," she said during a study group session. "Almost everything on our planet evolved to be dangerous. Plants, animals, insects, bacteria, weather patterns, geological events. Humans survived by becoming more dangerous than everything else." The alien students listened with growing horror as Minju described Earth's ecosystem. Predators that could run for hours without stopping. Plants that could kill with a single touch. Weather systems that regularly destroyed entire regions. Geological events that reshaped continents. "How do you live on such a world?" Vespera asked, her glowing wings trembling with distress. "We adapt," Minju replied simply. "We learn, we survive. We become harder to kill than the things trying to kill us." But the most disturbing discovery came when students began researching human military history beyond their recent space operations. What they found in Earth's historical records challenged their understanding of what warfare could be. Humans had been fighting continuous wars for over 5,000 years of recorded history. Not occasional conflicts over resources or territory, but constant, brutal warfare that involved entire populations. They had developed weapons designed specifically to cause maximum suffering. They had created tactics based on the assumption that enemies would fight to the death rather than surrender. The galactic community's approach to warfare was based on achieving objectives with minimal casualties through superior technology and tactical precision. Human warfare was based on the assumption that conflicts would be decided by which side could endure more suffering while continuing to fight. Doyun, a human student studying military history, tried to explain this to a group of increasingly disturbed alien classmates. "Other species developed warfare as an extension of politics," he said. "Humans developed warfare as a tool for survival. For us, fighting isn't about honor or glory or even winning. It's about not dying." This philosophical difference was what made human Marines so effective. They were not trained to fight according to rules or traditions. They were trained to win by any means necessary and to keep fighting no matter what happened to them. The alien students began to understand that human peacekeeping operations were actually highly efficient military conquests. Human police actions were what other species would call total warfare. Human defensive operations were strategic campaigns that eliminated threats so completely that enemies ceased to exist as organized forces. By the end of the week, the atmosphere at the academy had changed completely. Students who had once dismissed humans as primitive newcomers now avoided eye contact with their human classmates. Conversations became quieter when humans were present. The casual arrogance that had characterized discussions of human military capabilities was replaced by nervous uncertainty. Professor Veltar observed these changes with growing concern. His research had revealed statistical data about human Marine effectiveness, but his students were discovering the cultural and philosophical foundations that made such statistics possible. They were learning that humans were not just efficient killers, but beings whose entire civilization had been shaped by the necessity of constant warfare. The question Hannah had asked was being answered, but the answer was more disturbing than anyone had expected. A single Earth Marine could eliminate hundreds of enemies because human society had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of killing and surviving. The Academy Library had never seen such intense research activity. Students from dozens of species filled the research terminals, their faces lit by the glow of holographic displays showing data about human military history, what had started as a simple homework assignment had become an obsession as alien minds struggled to comprehend the scope of human warfare capability. Do-Yun sat at one of the central terminals, surrounded by a growing crowd of alien students who peppered him with increasingly desperate questions. As one of the few humans studying military archaeology, he had become an unwilling expert on his species' violent past. His simple explanations only seemed to make his audience more disturbed. "You have to understand the context," Do-Yun said. For the 10th time that day, his voice tired from hours of explanation. Earth is not a normal world by galactic standards. Life there developed under extreme pressure. Crystal leaned forward, his crystalline form refracting the terminal's light into nervous patterns. "But surely your species had periods of peace? Times when warfare was not necessary?" Do-Yun shook his head slowly. The longest period of general peace in recorded human history lasted about 30 years. Even then, there were still regional conflicts, civil wars, and what we called police actions happening somewhere on the planet. The alien students exchanged glances. Most of their species had conflicts measured in days or weeks, followed by decades or centuries of peace. The idea of continuous warfare for thousands of years was almost incomprehensible. "Why did your people not develop better diplomatic solutions?" Vespera asked, her musical voice carrying a note of genuine confusion. "Surely communication and negotiation would be more efficient than constant fighting?" "Humans tried diplomacy," Do-Yun replied. "We had thousands of treaties, peace agreements, and negotiated settlements. But there were always more conflicts. Resources were limited, populations were growing, and different groups had incompatible goals. Warfare became the default method for resolving disputes because it was often the only method that produced lasting results." Hyunjun joined the discussion from a nearby terminal where he had been researching human psychology. The young human had been studying xenopsychology but found himself explaining his own species' mental patterns to bewildered aliens. "The psychological pressure shaped how humans think," he explained. "Other species developed intelligence for tool use, communication, or environmental adaptation. Humans developed intelligence primarily for survival in a world where everything was trying to kill them." "Everything?" asked a silicon-based Korthan student. "Surely that is an exaggeration?" "Not really," Hyunjun replied. "Earth has predators that hunt in coordinated packs, plants that can kill with contact or consumption, insects that carry dozens of deadly diseases, weather patterns that can destroy cities, geological events that can eliminate entire regions without warning. Even the bacteria and viruses are actively hostile to human life." The Korthan student's mineral structure darkened with what might have been disbelief. "How does any species evolve intelligence under such conditions?" "By becoming more dangerous than everything else," Do-Yun answered simply. "Humans survived by developing the ability to kill any other life form on their planet. We became apex predators not through natural weapons like claws or fangs, but through intelligence applied to the problem of ending threats permanently." This explanation led to more questions about human evolutionary development. The alien students discovered that humans had evolved as persistence hunters, capable of tracking prey for days without stopping. They learned about human pattern recognition, abilities that allowed them to predict enemy behavior and plan accordingly. They found out about human capacity for rapid learning and adaptation that made them effective in any environment, but the most disturbing discovery was the human capacity for violence without emotional involvement. Other species fought when angry, afraid, or defending territory. Humans had developed the ability to kill efficiently and systematically without strong emotional motivation. They called it professionalism. Sora, a human student studying xenobiology, tried to explain this concept to a group of increasingly distressed aliens. Military training removes the emotional barriers to violence, she said. Human soldiers learn to eliminate threats as efficiently as possible without allowing feelings to interfere with tactical decisions. But how do you maintain unit cohesion without emotional bonds? Asked the Zephyrian student through its translator. Device. Hive species require emotional unity for effective coordination. Humans use something called discipline and training, Sora explained. We create artificial emotional bonds through shared experiences and mutual dependence. Marines are taught to value their unit's survival more than their own individual safety. It creates loyalty that is stronger than natural emotions. The alien students were beginning to understand that human military effectiveness was not based on superior technology or natural advantages. It was the result of thousands of years of cultural evolution that had optimized human society for warfare. Hyunjun pulled up historical data about human military development. Look at this progression, he said, activating a holographic timeline. Humans went from fighting with rocks and sticks to developing nuclear weapons in about 10,000 years. Most of that advancement was driven by military necessity. The timeline showed the acceleration of human technological development during periods of intense warfare. The alien students watched with growing alarm as the display showed humans creating increasingly effective methods of killing over remarkably short time periods. Your species developed nuclear weapons before you achieved spaceflight? Vespera asked, her wings dimming with shock. Yes, Hyunjun confirmed. We created devices capable of destroying entire cities before we learned to travel between stars. Military technology was always our highest priority because it was necessary for survival. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Professor Veltar, who had been searching the library for his students. The Altarian's 6 arms moved in agitated patterns as he approached the group gathered around the human students. I see you are conducting additional research, the professor observed, his blue skin showing the pale tinge that indicated stress. Have you discovered anything particularly significant? Crystal gestured toward the displays around them. Professor, the scale of human military history is beyond anything we imagined. They have been fighting continuous wars for millennia. Their entire civilization is based on warfare. Not based on warfare, Doyan corrected gently. Shaped by warfare, there is a difference. Humans do not fight because we enjoy it. We fight because we are good at it, and being good at it kept us alive long enough to develop civilization. Professor. Veltar studied the research displays with growing concern. His own investigation had revealed the statistical effectiveness of human marines, but these students were discovering the cultural and evolutionary foundations that made such effectiveness possible. What about human art, literature, philosophy? The professor asked. Surely your species has cultural achievements beyond military applications? Of course, Sora replied. But much of our greatest art and literature is about war. Our philosophy often deals with questions of survival, sacrifice, and the morality of violence. Even our entertainment frequently involves conflict and combat. She activated another display showing examples of human cultural achievements. The alien students examined music, paintings, sculptures, and literature from across human history. But as they studied the works more carefully, they realized that themes of conflict, struggle, and survival appeared constantly. Your creation? Myths involve warfare between gods, Vespera observed, her voice filled with something approaching horror. Your heroes are warriors, your greatest stories are about battles and conquests. War shaped our imagination as much as our technology, Hyunjun explained. Humans tell stories about conflict because conflict is what made us who we are. We admire warriors because warriors kept our species alive. The alien students began to understand that human military capability was not an aberration or a temporary phase of development. It was the fundamental characteristic that defined human civilization. Everything else, art, science, philosophy, technology, had developed within the context of a species. Optimized for survival through violence. Du Hyun pulled up one final display that showed human population distribution across Earth's history. "Look at this pattern," he said. "Human populations grow until they reach the carrying capacity of their environment. Then conflicts break out that reduce the population back to sustainable levels. This cycle repeated for thousands of years." "Your species uses warfare for population control?" the Korthan student asked, its mineral structure showing deep blue stress patterns. "Not consciously," Do-Yeon replied, "but the effect is the same. Humans fight when resources become scarce or when populations grow too large for their environment to support. It is an automatic response that has kept our species from destroying itself through overpopulation." Professor Veltar realized that his students had discovered something far more significant than military statistics. They had found evidence that humans were not just efficient warriors, but a species whose entire evolutionary and cultural development had been shaped. The Academy's secure research facility had never been used for this type of investigation. Professor Veltar had obtained special permissions to access the most classified military databases in the galactic network, driven by the increasingly disturbing discoveries his students had made about human warfare capabilities. What they found in the restricted files about the Terran Marine Corps changed everything. Crystal stared at the holographic display showing the organizational structure of the human military. His crystalline form had lost much of its usual brilliance. As the scope of human military forces became clear, "How many Marines does Earth have?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. June, a human student studying cultural anthropology, checked the current data feeds. "Approximately 200,000 active duty Marines," she replied, "plus another 300,000 in reserve units that can be activated within 30 days. The number sent shockwaves through the assembled alien students. Most species maintain military forces in the low thousands. The idea of 500,000 elite soldiers from a single species was staggering. "But these are just the Marines," June continued, seemingly unaware of the effect her words were having. "Earth also has the Army, Navy, Air Force, Space Force, and various special operations units. Total active military personnel is approximately 12 million, with another 20 million in reserve status." The Spira-S wings fluttered with distress. 32 million soldiers? How is that possible? What does your species need so many warriors for? Humans have always maintained large military forces, June explained matter-of-factly. It is considered necessary for national security and global stability. Most human nations require their citizens to serve in the military or maintain the capability to do so if needed. Professor Veltar activated a new database search, focusing specifically on Marine Corps training and doctrine. What appeared on the displays made his skin turn the pale white color that indicated extreme distress in his species. The training regimen for human Marines was unlike anything in the galactic database. New recruits underwent 13 weeks of intensive conditioning that would kill most members of other species. They were taught to fight with weapons, without weapons, in any environment, under any conditions. "Look at this section on hand-to-hand combat training," the professor said, highlighting a portion of the training manual. Marines learned 17 different ways to kill an opponent using only their hands. They practice these techniques until they can perform them audibly, even when injured or exhausted. The alien students studied the combat techniques with growing horror. The movements were efficient, brutal, and designed specifically to end life as quickly as possible. There was no consideration for honor, tradition, or giving enemies a chance to surrender. The techniques were pure applications of force intended to eliminate threats permanently. SORA pulled up additional training documentation. "Marines also learned to create weapons from common objects," she said, activating a demonstration video. "Eating utensils, writing implements, pieces of clothing, broken equipment. The philosophy is that a Marine should be able to kill an enemy, even when completely disarmed. The video showed human instructors teaching students to use ordinary items as lethal weapons. A simple pen became a stabbing tool capable of penetrating vital organs. A belt became a strangling device. Broken glass became surgical instruments for severing arteries. Why would your species develop such training? The Zephyrian student asked through its translator. Surely modern weapons make such skills unnecessary. Marines operate in situations where modern weapons may not be available, Sora explained. They are trained to complete their missions regardless of equipment failures, supply shortages, or battlefield conditions. Self-sufficiency is a core principle of Marine doctrine. Hyunjun accessed another section of the Marine training database. Physical conditioning is just the beginning, he said, displaying psychological evaluation criteria. Marines undergo mental conditioning designed to remove natural inhibitions against violence. They learn to function effectively under extreme stress, to make life-or-death decisions instantly, and to continue fighting even when severely wounded. The psychological training record showed techniques that bordered on mind control. Human recruits were systematically broken down and rebuilt according to military specifications. Their individual personalities were modified to create warriors who could kill without hesitation and follow orders without question. But most disturbing was the discovery that this psychological conditioning was reversible. Marines could function as normal members of society when not on duty, then switch instantly to combat mode when necessary. They were essentially civilians who carried the capacity for extreme violence within them at all times. Professor Veltar discovered a section on Marine Corps philosophy that made him understand why human warriors were so effective. Read this passage, he said, highlighting text on the main display. Every Marine is a rifleman. Regardless of military occupation specialty, every Marine is trained and ready to engage the enemy as an infantryman. Cooks, mechanics, administrators, and communications specialists are all capable of frontline combat. The alien students stared at the words in disbelief. Other species maintained clear distinctions between combat troops and support personnel. The idea that every member of a military unit was a trained killer was unprecedented in galactic military doctrine. This means that human logistics personnel are more dangerous than most species' elite soldiers, Crystal observed, his voice filled with something approaching despair. That is correct, June confirmed. A human Marine cook or clerk has received the same basic combat training as frontline assault troops. They can all use weapons, fight hand-to-hand, and operate independently in hostile territory. The research revealed more disturbing details about Marine Corps' capabilities. Individual Marines were cross-trained in multiple specialties. A communications expert could also function as a medic, demolitions specialist, or sniper depending on mission requirements. Small Marine units contain more diverse capabilities than entire alien military companies. Do-Yun pulled up operational records showing how these capabilities translated into battlefield effectiveness. Look at the Battle of Kepler Station, he said, displaying a tactical analysis. 48 Marines defended a space station against over 2,000 attackers for 6 days. They held their positions by using the station's own systems as weapons. The battle records showed Marines using life support controls to suffocate enemies in sealed compartments. They had reprogrammed automatic systems to create deadly obstacles and traps. They had converted maintenance equipment into improvised weapons. Most remarkably, they had done all of this while maintaining communications discipline and coordinating their actions perfectly. How did so few Marines coordinate such complex operations? Vespera asked. Marine training emphasizes initiative and independent thinking, Sora explained. Each Marine is taught to understand the overall mission and to take appropriate action, even when isolated from command. They do not need constant supervision or detailed orders. This was perhaps the most alien concept of all. Other species relied on centralized command structures, hive minds, or technological coordination systems. Marines functioned as independent agents who somehow achieved perfect coordination through training and shared understanding of their objectives. The alien students discovered that Marine training included something called leadership principles that were taught to every recruit regardless of rank. Every Marine was expected to be capable of taking command if their superiors were killed or disabled. They were trained to inspire others, make tactical decisions, and accept responsibility for mission success or failure. Professor Veltar found documentation about Marine Corps, traditions that revealed the psychological foundations of their effectiveness. Marines are taught that they are part of an unbroken chain of warriors stretching back over 2 centuries, he read from a training manual. They believe that the spirits of dead Marines watch over them in battle and that failure would dishonor all who came before. This spiritual dimension of Marine culture was unlike anything in galactic military tradition. Marines fought not just for tactical objectives or strategic goals, but for the honor of their dead comrades and the reputation of their organization. They considered death in battle to be preferable to failure or surrender, the research revealed. The Marines studied the battles and sacrifices of previous generations as part of their regular training. They memorized the names of heroes who had died in famous actions. They learned the details of historical battles where Marines had achieved victory against impossible odds. This creates a psychological pressure to match or exceed the performance of previous Marines, Hyunjun observed. Each generation tries to prove itself worthy of the tradition they have inherited. As the day wore on, the alien students compiled a picture of the Marine Corps that defied every assumption about military organization and effectiveness. Marines were individually more capable than most species' elite units. They operated with independence that would be considered insubordination. In other militaries, they accepted casualty rates that would be considered catastrophic failures by galactic standards, most disturbing of all. The morning of the presentation arrived with an atmosphere unlike any Professor Veltar had experienced in his decades of teaching. Students filed into the classroom in unusual silence, their research materials clutched tightly as they took their seats. The casual confidence that had characterized previous classes was gone, replaced by nervous tension and frequent glances toward the human students. Hannah entered the room and took her usual seat in the back row. She carried her simple notebook and pen, appearing unchanged from the first day of class. But now every alien student in the room was acutely aware of what that quiet, unremarkable appearance might conceal. The young woman who had asked a simple question 2 weeks ago had fundamentally altered their understanding of an entire species. Professor Veltar's 6 arms moved in restless patterns as he prepared for what he knew would be the most difficult class session of his career. His skin had remained the pale white color of extreme stress for the past 3 days as he reviewed his students' research findings. What they had discovered would change galactic politics forever. Today we present our research findings, the professor announced, his voice carefully controlled. I believe we will all learn something significant about the nature of warfare and military effectiveness. Crystal was the first to present, but the crystalline Vorthak student bore no resemblance to the confident being who had mocked human military capabilities just 2 weeks earlier. His usual brilliant luminescence was dim and his voice carried none of its previous arrogance. I researched the statistical effectiveness of individual Terran Marines, he began, activating a holographic display that showed charts and graphs. The numbers are difficult to comprehend. The display showed casualty ratios from dozens of human military operations. The alien students leaned forward to study the data, their expressions growing increasingly disturbed as the implications became clear. The average confirmed kill count for a single Terran Marine in active combat zones is 847 hostile entities. Crystal continued, his voice barely above a whisper. This number represents only confirmed eliminations where positive identification was possible. Probable kills and deaths resulting from indirect actions are not included. The silence that followed was complete. No student moved, no translator device made a sound. The number hung in the air like a physical presence that pressed down on everyone in the room. To provide context, Krikstal went on, the most effective Vorthak warrior in our recorded history achieved 127 confirmed eliminations during a career spanning 4 decades. That individual is considered a legendary figure whose achievements are celebrated across our entire civilization. He paused, looking around at his fellow students before delivering the final comparison. A typical Terran Marine surpasses our greatest legendary warrior by more than 6 times. And there are approximately 200,000 active-duty Marines, plus 300,000 reserves. Vespera presented next, her musical voice now carrying notes of distress that made her words sound like a funeral dirge. I studied human tactics and coordination. Methods, she said, her glowing wings barely visible. Humans achieve perfect military coordination without hive minds, harmonic linking, or technological assistance. Her presentation showed battle recordings from Marine operations where small units had outmaneuvered much larger enemy forces through superior tactics and communication. The alien students watched Marines coordinate complex maneuvers using only voice communications and hand signals, achieving results that would require sophisticated technological interfaces for other species. Most disturbing, Vespera continued, is their concept of individual initiative. Marines are trained to act independently when communication is lost or commanders are eliminated. They continue fighting according to their understanding of overall objectives rather than waiting for specific orders. This concept was particularly alien to species that relied on centralized command structures. The idea of soldiers making independent tactical decisions while somehow maintaining perfect coordination with their units defied every principle of galactic military doctrine. The Zephian student presented findings about human training methods that left the class in stunned silence. Through its translator device, it described conditioning techniques that would be considered torture by most species standards. Human recruits were subjected to physical and psychological stress that would kill or permanently damage members of other civilizations. Humans break down individual identity and rebuild according to military specifications, the mechanical voice reported. Process creates warriors who follow orders without question but think independently when necessary. Contradiction impossible to understand by hive mind logic. Do-Yun reluctantly provided historical context that made the situation even more disturbing. Human military effectiveness is not aberrant, he explained to his increasingly distressed classmates. It represents thousands of years of evolutionary pressure and cultural development. Warfare shaped human civilization at the most fundamental level. His presentation showed the timeline of human technological development, revealing how military necessity had driven advances in everything from metallurgy to medicine to communication systems. The pattern was clear. Humans had optimized their entire civilization for warfare effectiveness. Other species developed technology for exploration, communication, or environmental adaptation, Do-Yun observed. Humans developed technology primarily to kill enemies more efficiently and to avoid being killed themselves. Sora's presentation about Marine Corps' philosophy sent waves of shock through the alien students. Marines are taught that death is preferable to mission failure, she reported matter-of-factly. They accept casualty rates that other species would consider catastrophic defeats. A mission with 90% casualties is considered successful if objectives are achieved. The mathematical implications were staggering. Humans could absorb losses that would cripple other military forces and continue fighting at full effectiveness. They had built an entire military culture around the assumption that soldiers would die in large numbers, and they planned accordingly. Hyunjun's psychological analysis revealed perhaps the most disturbing aspect of human military culture. Marines maintain the capacity for extreme violence while functioning as normal members of society, he explained. They can switch between civilian and combat modes instantly, without warning or preparation time. This meant that every human in civilian clothes potentially carried the combat effectiveness of a galactic elite warrior. The friendly exchange students sitting in the classroom were trained killers, who could eliminate dozens of enemies if the situation required it, Professor. Veltar watched his students present their findings with growing alarm. Each presentation added another layer to the emerging picture of humanity as a species optimized for warfare beyond anything the galaxy had previously encountered. June's cultural analysis provided the final piece of the puzzle. Human entertainment, art, literature, and philosophy all reflect their warfare-oriented development, she said, showing examples of human cultural achievements. Their greatest heroes are warriors. Their most celebrated stories involve conflict and conquest. Their moral systems are based on concepts like duty, sacrifice, and honor that derive from military traditions. The alien students studied human artwork that glorified battle, literature that celebrated military virtues, and music that inspired warriors preparing for combat. They realized that human civilization was not just shaped by warfare, it was designed to produce warriors. When the presentations ended, the classroom remained silent for several minutes. Students stared at their research displays, trying to process the implications of what they had learned. The numbers were clear, but the reality they represented was almost impossible to accept. Professor Veltar finally spoke, his voice carefully controlled despite the stress patterns visible in his pale skin. Based on these research findings, I believe we must reconsider humanity's classification within the galactic community, he said. The evidence suggests that humans represent a military capability unlike anything in our recorded history. Crystal raised a trembling crystalline hand. Professor, what does this mean for galactic security? If humans are this effective at warfare, what prevents them from conquering other species? The question hung in the air like a threat. Every student in the room was thinking the same thing. If humans could achieve such overwhelming military results, why were they seeking peaceful membership in the galactic community instead of simply taking what they wanted? Hannah stood up slowly from her seat in the back row. Every alien student turned to look at her, and many of them involuntarily moved away as if her quiet presence had become physically threatening. "You're asking the wrong question," she said, in the same calm voice that had started this entire investigation. "The question is not what prevents humans from conquering other species. The question is why humans would need to." She looked around the room, meeting the frightened gazes of her classmates. "You have discovered what humans are capable of when we fight, but you have not yet discovered why we fight. That understanding will determine whether you see us as enemies, to be feared, or allies to be valued." With that, she gathered her simple notebook and pen, walked quietly out of the classroom. 3 days after the presentations, the Stellar Military Academy was a changed place. Students moved through corridors in small, quiet groups, their conversations hushed and their behavior noticeably different when human students were present. The casual arrogance that had characterized interactions between species had been replaced by careful politeness and nervous respect. Professor Veltar sat in his office, composing what he knew would be the most important report of his academic career. On his desk lay classified documents, statistical analyses, and research findings that would fundamentally alter the galactic community's understanding of humanity. His 6 arms worked frantically as he prepared recommendations for the Galactic Federation Council. The door chimed softly, and Crystal entered without his usual dramatic flair. The crystalline Vorthax student moved slowly, his luminescence dim and uncertain. "Professor, I need to understand something," he said, his voice lacking its former confidence. "What troubles you, Crystal?" Veltar asked, setting aside his work. "If humans are this capable of warfare, why are they seeking peaceful integration with the galactic community? Why not simply take what they want through conquest?" The student's question echoed the fears that had spread throughout the academy since the presentations. Before the professor could respond, Hannah appeared in the doorway. She had been waiting outside, listening to the conversation. Her simple human appearance seemed somehow more significant now that everyone understood what it might conceal. "May I answer that?" she asked quietly. Both professor and student nodded. Though Crystal visibly tensed at her presence, Hannah entered the office and took a seat across from them. She set down her familiar notebook and pen, the simple tools that had become symbols of humanity's deceptive ordinariness. "Humans do not fight because we enjoy conquest," she began in her calm, matter-of-fact voice. We fight because we are good at surviving, and survival sometimes requires violence. But survival also requires cooperation, trade, communication, and peaceful coexistence when possible. She opened her notebook to a page covered with neat handwriting. You discovered our military capabilities, but you did not research our diplomatic history. Humans have created thousands of peaceful agreements, trade partnerships, and cooperative ventures. We prefer these solutions when they work. Crystal leaned forward, his crystalline structure catching the office lights. But your species is so effective at warfare. Surely conquest would be easier than diplomacy? Conquest is only easier in the short term, Hannah replied. Humans learned long ago that ruling conquered peoples requires constant military presence, suppression of rebellions, and enormous resource expenditure. It is much more efficient to create willing partners than reluctant subjects. Professor Veltar activated a holographic display showing galactic trade routes and diplomatic agreements. Show us what you mean, he requested. Hannah studied the display for a moment, then began pointing to various star systems. Here, humans negotiated mining rights in exchange for technological assistance. There, we provided security services in return for agricultural products. Over there, we established joint research facilities that benefit both human and alien scientists. The pattern became clear as she continued. Humanity was expanding through the galaxy not by conquest, but by making itself useful to other species. They offered military protection, technological innovation, and resource development in exchange for access to new worlds and trading opportunities. Humans understand that cooperation produces better long-term results than domination, Hannah explained. We learned this through thousands of years of trial and error on Earth. Empires built on conquest eventually collapse. Partnerships based on mutual benefit can last for centuries. The office door chimed again, and other students began entering. Word had spread that Hannah was providing explanations about human motivations, and alien students were eager to understand what they had discovered during their research. Vespera was among the first to arrive, her musical voice carrying notes of genuine curiosity rather than fear. If humans prefer cooperation, why maintain such large military forces? Why train every Marine to be so effective at killing? Because cooperation only works when all parties respect each other's capabilities. Hannah answered. Humans negotiate from a position of strength so that agreements are honored and partnerships remain stable. Hyunjun entered the office and took a seat near the back, nodding agreement with Hannah's explanation. The phrase we use is peace through strength, he added. Other species are more likely to honor agreements when they understand the consequences of breaking them. Doyun arrived with several other human students, and the office began to feel crowded. Professor Veltar moved the discussion to a larger conference room, where more students could participate in what was becoming an impromptu seminar on human strategic thinking. Let me ask a different question, said the Zephyrian student through its translator device. What would happen if galactic species chose to oppose human expansion? What would be your species' response? The room fell silent as alien students waited for the answer. This was the question that had been haunting the Academy since the research presentations. June, a human cultural studies student, responded carefully. Humans would prefer to find peaceful solutions through negotiation and compromise. But if threatened with extinction or prevented from accessing resources necessary for survival, we would defend ourselves with whatever force was required. Define whatever force was required, Crystal requested. Though his voice suggested he was not sure he wanted to know the answer. SOR answered with the same matter-of-fact tone that characterized all human discussions of warfare. Total war. Complete mobilization of all human resources until the threat was eliminated. History shows that humans do not accept defeat when survival is at stake. The alien students exchanged glances. They had learned enough about human military capabilities to understand what total war would mean. The casual way humans discussed the potential annihilation of entire species was more frightening than any threat or boast. Professor Veltar. realized that the conversation had revealed the fundamental truth about humanity's place in the galaxy. So, the choice facing the galactic community is cooperation or destruction? Not exactly, Hannah corrected. The choice is cooperation or conflict. Destruction would only occur if other species chose to make survival impossible for humans. We would much rather build than destroy, create than annihilate, grow than conquer. Minju, who had been quiet throughout the discussion, finally spoke up. You have to understand that humans do not see ourselves as conquerors or destroyers. We see ourselves as survivors who have learned to be very good at staying alive. Everything else, our technology, our culture, our military capabilities, developed in service of that goal. But now that humans have achieved survival, what comes next? Vespera asked. What does your species want from the galaxy? Hyunsu, a human philosophy student who had just entered the room, answered the question.